Thank you for that introduction. And with that, I should probably ask you to fasten your seatbelts. But again, I will try not to speak too fast, but for sure, I have quite a bit of things to say to you today. But first of all, a very, very warm welcome. It's thrilling to see the house filled up. And I know also that beyond the screen, we have a lot of people following us. And with the interesting view of EFTA and the EU presidency, presented by our excellent previous speakers, highlighting our common interests, goals and values, I now have the honor to introduce a bit more to to EFTA and to the function of the EEA Agreement. Oh, thank you. So we like to call the Internal Market Division of the Secretariat the heart of the EEA Agreement. That is not only because of the people working there, but being responsible for all the policy areas covered by this agreement, and thereby the preparation of each and every legal act that should be incorporated to the agreement. EU acts are constantly floating in and out of our division, to the member states and back, and to the EU, and sometimes back and forth also there. And to understand these processes and on how the agreement is managed, this is, in my view, essential to complete the picture of our special relationship and cooperation with the EU and its member states. So I will introduce to you what this work is all about and the role of the Secretariat in this respect. Earlier this morning, we heard our Secretariat General say a bit about the history of EFTA and the responsibilities of the Secretariat. In short, we are responsible for managing the EFTA Convention, the convention that established our association and also regulates the trade between its 4 member states. We are also assisting our member states in managing the EFTA's worldwide network of free trade agreements. And here in Brussels, our main task is to manage and facilitate a well-functioning EEA agreement. And before I go and say more about that, I would like to say a bit about a few words on our third EFTA duty station, namely the EFTA Statistical Office, which is in charge of EFTA Statistical Cooperation. The purpose of this statistical cooperation is to develop, produce, and disseminate high-quality, coherent, and comparable European statistics that supports the functioning of the internal market. Because any developments in our societies of regulations should be based on facts and understanding of what the world really looks like. So that is why this office, which is co-located with Eurostat in Luxembourg, is having an essential role. The role of the Statistic Office in this work is to support the EFTA states' full participation without the right to vote in the European statistical system. And when I then say the EFTA states, I mean the EFTA 4. Because this cooperation is extending the internal market through the EEA to the whole EEA, through the EEA agreement, but also through bilateral agreements between the EU and Switzerland. It should facilitate the incorporation with relevant statistical acts into the agreement. There we work really close with our office in Luxembourg, provide seconded national experts to Eurostat from our countries, and monitor the inclusion of statistics on EFTA states in the ESS publications. Outside of the EEA, we also do some cooperation, namely provides technical assistance with partner organizations. And this is to build capacity in neighboring countries and regions so that they are able to produce official statistics that meets European standards. So, back to Brussels. Okay, I was jumping a bit here, sorry. In Brussels, the Secretariat's role is being the Secretariat for the EFTA states in their EEA work, meaning facilitating what we call the EEA process. We have a coordinating role between our 3 member states and the European Commission. In addition, we are the Secretariat for the EEA advisory bodies. My excellent colleague Peter Gunnarsson will say a bit more about this later, so I leave the advisory bodies for now. Then the agreement. I will say a bit about why we have the agreement, the objectives and the principles, what is the scope, and what is it supposed to do for its contracting partners and what not. And finally, how is the setup that ensure that these objectives and principles are fulfilled. The EEA agreement, as you have understood, is an agreement between the EU and the 3 EEA EFTA states, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. And the objective of this agreement is that it's establishing a dynamic and homogeneous European economic area based on common rules and equal conditions for competition and providing for the adequate means of enforcement at judicial level. I would say that this objective is our guiding star in the Secretariat. This is something we work for every single day. Every word that we are writing in order to make the EU law fit into the agreement is based on this objective. The agreement is extending the internal market to the participating EFTA states, and it's based on 2 very important principles. A core principle is that it's dynamic, meaning that we are incorporating any new and relevant EU legislation into the agreement, and this is done continuously. Secondly, another core principle is that the rules should be applied and enforced in the same manner throughout the whole of the EEA, not only within the EEA EFTA states, but in the 30 states as a whole. And this is why we have a setup for surveillance and litigations that you are lucky enough to hear a bit more from our colleagues later on. And now we come to my favorite slide. Because what is this all about? The EU agreement had one challenge. It was going to reconcile 2 very different models of cooperation. On the EU side, there is the supranationality, where there is transfer of competence and sovereignty. In the EFTA model, we have intergovernmental cooperation, where there are no transfer of competence and no so-called common policies. In the EU, the institutions have defined roles in the decision-making process, the Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council, where the member states are represented. On our side, the decisions are taken by consensus between governments. The EU is to preserve one important concern, preserving the decision-making autonomy of the EU. Where on the other side, the EFTA model should preserve the sovereignty that our member states did not want to let go of, and therefore the EEA agreement. Obviously, when making the EU law fitting into the agreement, we need to preserve these 2 very important but quite different principles. Any adaptations needed to make EU law EEA law needs to be in line and not undermine the fact that the EU has and will continue to preserve its decision-making autonomy. It should not water out the legislation that 27 countries has already agreed upon. This is the institutional setup of the European Economic Area. It's commonly referred to as the 2-pillar structure. It reflects that the EEA cooperation takes part in 2 pillars, the EFTA pillar and the EU pillar with its institutions. In addition, and the blue boxes are specific common bodies in the middle. On the left side, then you have EFTA, and on the right side, the EU pillar. The highest governing body of the this setup is the EEA Council. This is where the parties meet at a political level for our member states, represented by the Ministers of Foreign Affairs. And the EU side is represented by the presidency and the Commission Secretariat General. The Joint Committee on the EFTA side is the governing body, is the main decision-making body of the EEA Agreement. And the Standing Committee, where we heard that Liechtenstein currently holds the chair, is the highest governing body of the EFTA states, where ambassadors meet to consult and arrive at common positions before they meet the EU in the Joint Committee the day after. These bodies meet 8 times a year. The last meetings were last week in this very room. The remaining of the two-pillar structure will be presented by colleagues from ESA, EFTA Court, and also by the Secretariat. So I will leave that here so that you don't have to hear it several times. Well, with the objective in mind, what is then the substantive scope? What areas does the EEA cooperation cover? The core of the agreement is full participation and application of the so-called 4 freedoms, which means that there should be no unlawful restrictions to the free movements of goods, services, capitals, and persons within the EEA. And to support and make sure that this level playing field is not hampered by other forms of restrictive behavior, the EEA Agreement has common rules on state aid, competition, and public procurement. These rules are there to prevent companies from entering into harmful business models. Through the agreement, the EFTA states also participate in policy areas that are seen to have impact on the internal market. We call them horizontal policies. Some of them, to give you an idea, is environment, social policy, consumer protection, statistics that I've spoken about a bit earlier, and company law. And finally, the agreement also provides for participation in EU programs. Our member states have chosen to take part of several of the EU programs. These programs, of course, open up a new world of cooperation all over Europe within the EEA in areas of research and innovation, and not to mention, since there are so many young people here, education, and I'm sure many of you have heard of the Erasmus program. This is a very important part of our cooperation with the EU because it makes our scientists, societies and many levels, students, young people, to participate in the Europe-wide cooperation and to broaden the understanding and to find better solutions for across Europe. This one disappeared, came back, yes, thank you. And in the end, the EFTA also contributes quite substantially to reduce social and economical disparities in Europe, but that I will leave to Ragnar Fidestøl, the Managing Director of EEA and Norway Grants. Then to the EEA process, the framework for participation and engagement. There is 2 main strands of the EEA work: decision shaping, the participation in the development of EU legislation before EU adopts new legislation, and decision making, incorporation of an adopted EU EEA relevant legislative act into the EEA agreement. And I am going to go through a bit to give you a glimpse of what that is all about. Decision shaping by the EEA EFTA states. Well, the starting point is this. The EEA EFTA states takes on board EU legislation through the EEA agreement, but the agreement does not grant our member states voting rights or decision-making rights on the EU side. Therefore, the objective of participating in the decision shaping is to contribute to the development of EU legislation, policy, and strategies until they are formally adopted. Because as I mentioned earlier, it is at the early stage before adoption where these legislations policies are at play. After that, 27 countries has already agreed and the influence and the room for maneuverment is much more narrow. And also, I would say the participation in decision or in development of legal acts in the broader sense, of course, is better at an earlier stage. And what means do we have to do so? We are not EEA members. Well, the EEA agreement is actually catering for us there. We are supposed to be consulted at the same level as a member state. In practice, that means that experts from our capitals are participating in Commission expert groups and committees, but without the right to vote. Nevertheless, we have the right to speak, to contribute, and also participate in studies and any mapping of any areas that is considered for legal development. We do early assessment by the EFTA states of EFTA challenges in EU proposals. Our 3 countries are agreeing to EEA EFTA comments. That's a common position paper where our 3 countries agree on a position to either a proposed strategy or even to a proposal of legal acts. And of course, we have informal contacts between EEA EFTA officials and the EU Council and European Parliament, and also I would say the Commission. Lastly, I've put up also secondment of national experts to the Commission. Our member states are providing experts who work in the Commission. We are, of course, as any other member states of the EU, very well aware that they are working for the Commission. Nevertheless, as much as this is an important tool for the EU member states, it's equally important for our member states because you come in to your workplace with your background, your understanding, and contribute to the development of within the EEA in the broader sense. And not to mention, it gives, again, the expert a unique way of understanding how things are functioning within the European Commission and other institutions, and can bring that back home to capitals afterwards. And then I will shortly say a bit about, well, wonderful, we can contribute like this, but when should we do it? The core here is from as early as possible, that we often hear, we have to be early. But even more important, I would say, to the very end. We cannot just present one of our position papers and think that that is it. Here is an overview of how and when Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway are involved with EU policy development and EU legislation process. If you look on the right side here, you see a very overview of EU legislation process. Our member states are able to participate and contribute at all levels. Of course, as I said, at the expert level in expert groups, it's easier. But also when a proposal has been sent over to the Council and European Parliament, it is a possibility to of course talk and influence also there. I think one of the main things that our cooperation is where we feel even a bit more lucky than the EU states is that the Commission and others are very willing to come to our working groups. That means that they come to us, they sit and explain proposals, and our 3 member states are quite free and open to ask questions to understand the thinking behind this. For those of you that are joining this afternoon workshop on decision shaping with Trond and Elizabeth, they will guide you through some very useful and up-to-date experiences on how to succeed. So for now, I am just showing you this as a glimpse on how and when things should be done. Then a bit to the decision-making process. Again, we're back to the 2-pillar structure. To facilitate the EEA work and to meet challenges and find solutions when an EU act doesn't really fit into the EEA agreement. We have a structure set up where the Secretariat plays its role in assisting the EFTA states on many different levels. This one you have already seen, but if we go a bit backwards in time, before a decision reaches the standing committee where our ambassadors meet, a lot of work has been done. I wish this army, of course, was very big, but it's not so big. It is not so big in this house. It's not so big in capitals, but it is what it is. And I think also through member states in Europe, it is a bit the same. I think we could all want to have more hands, but on the other hand, it functions not too bad because I think the setup we have is a good one for facilitating this work. The detailed part of this work, my colleague Finne Bergeson will say a bit more about later on. So I will just say a bit about the structural setup. So behind the standing committee and our work in the Secretariat when it comes to making EU law, EEA law, is working behind the red, white and blue box there. Because the standing committee is supported by a structure to ensure and assist participation in the development of EU law, as I mentioned, but also in preparations for the formal incorporation of relevant legal acts into the EEA Agreement. Because we start a bit later than the EU on this. The moment the EU has already adopted an act, that's when my registrar here on the 5th floor, who is actually in the room, at least he was earlier, there he is, is the one who is going through all the official journals of the EU, picking out what we think is EU relevant. And here I want to mention one thing, because sometimes we find that it says text with EEA relevance. That is, of course, a very good indication on what the EU side thinks about this text. Nevertheless, whether an act is EU relevant or EEA relevant or not is a decision made by our 3 member states and with the EU on the other side. So in principle, they then indicate what they think on this act, and then our member states do their own assessments. So back to the structure again. The standing committee is supported by 5 subcommittees. Subcommittee 1 to 4 are, as you may recognize, structured in a way that they are responsible for the different 4 freedoms and also these flanking and horizontal policies. All these groups here are representing the EFTA working groups. This is where capitals are meeting to assess new legislation, but also where we invite the Commission in. These 4 are the ones of my units, my division. We are facilitating the work of these 4 subcommittees. The subcommittee 5, responsible for legal and institutional matters, they don't meet. We meet 8 times a year as well, at the same as the standing in the joint committee, a week before. The subcommittee 5 has a bit different role, more overarching. They also meet less frequent, but nevertheless important to take care of horizontal issues. And then regarding the second strand, the decision-making process, as I said, I will not go into that now because you will hear more about that later in detail. But before our coffee break, I just want to round up with a couple of things. First of all, what are we really talking about here? Well, since the beginning, or at the beginning and the signing of the agreement, 1,875 acts was signed, was incorporated into the agreement when we signed the agreement in 1992. As already mentioned today, more than 14,000 acts are incorporated since then. And about 7,000 acts are in force. The biggest area of all the acts incorporated in 2022 was food and veterinary, 38.5%. That ensures full compliance with EU rules on food chain, frictionless export of seafood and agricultural goods, and no veterinary import or export controls, only customs. Other high volume sectors within the EEA agreement is transport in general, air, road, rail, and maritime. Financial services, goods, which is technical regulations and specifications, and environment is definitely up and coming. You might have heard of the Green Deal, which is going to facilitate the necessary green shift. That is coming in with its full strength these next couple of years, particularly on environment, and other areas will follow. I'm not going to say a lot about this, but this is the famous backlog that some of you might have heard of. I said we start later than the EU, and we need to, and because of that, we have an inherent backlog. In addition, we need to make the acts fit into the agreement, because sometimes the acts is regulating things that are outside the agreement, or we need to cater for this sovereignty that I was talking about earlier in my favorite slide. The green bars here is showing the amount of EU legal acts identified every year. So you can see also from the EU side, we are seeing an increased number of not only acts, but also a complexity. Secondly, on the blue bar is what we have already incorporated. This list is from August this year, where we had 343. Last week, we incorporated around 100 acts, so we are now more than 400 acts. To round off and finalize, I want to say, so what about the EEA agreement today? Is it fit for purpose? I think I would agree with our Liechtenstein ambassador. The agreement and the function of it is going very well, and it is ready to celebrate its 30 years. But there are some challenges, of course. The increased regulatory powers to EU agencies. This was not at all catered for in '94 when the agreement was signed. The EU law and the EU EEA law have different scope that I have spoken a bit about more a bit earlier. And recently, we're even seeing that the EU is using internal market legislation, which normally is inside the EU agreement, to regulate elements like trade and customs that is outside, or industry policy. EU adopts more and more complex legislation. And I think the final touch of this is that to understand and to really facilitate and to make this agreement work, we need to train our capitals. We need to train ourselves, also within the Secretariat, to understand and have as broad and deep knowledge as possible. This is the best way to ensure a well-functioning EEA agreement. So with that, I am particularly pleased to thank you for participating, and thank you for your attention.